Continuing now our conversation about teen driving with this list of 7 critical risk factors. So if the question is, why are teenagers much more likely to have difficulties as drivers, like motor vehicle crashes and accidents and so forth? I think this is a pretty good list. It's going to involve the passengers in the car with the teenager. So that's going to end up being a critical risk factor, which we'll look at, is that the risk of teenage driving are greatly increased by the number of passengers in the car with them, the number of teenage passengers in the car with them specifically. The risk factors for teenagers are higher because, by definition, they're less experienced drivers than their parents as a group. Inexperience makes a difference because driving is a complex task. Those of us who have been doing it for a long time have a tendency to forget how complicated it is because we've developed such experience with it. It's not to say we don't make mistakes, we do all the time, but we forget how complex it is because so much of driving becomes automated. And as a general rule, the more experience you have with a complicated task, the better you are at it and the safer you are at it. So no surprise that being 16 does contribute to the problem. It's not so much age as it is inexperience. Teenagers are less likely to wear their seatbelts than adult drivers, particularly when they're in the back seat of a car. And I always challenge people to start paying attention to this one when they read about accidents, terrible accidents in motor vehicles, including teenagers, how often the casualties are not wearing their seatbelts. Alcohol and drugs are a contributing factor. Sleepiness, sleep deprivation is a factor. Distracted driving and nighttime driving. And you might look at that list and say those are potentially problems for risk factors for all drivers, and that's true for the most part. But it just turns out that these risk factors are more likely to contribute to problems if the driver is a teenager than if she's not a teenager. A very frustrating and tragic thing is that these risk factors, major things that tend to contribute to these terrible motor vehicle crashes, tend to cluster together, meaning they occur at the same time. So let's say that this weekend there would be a big concert someplace involving a musical artist that's popular among teenagers and college-age students. So you got a bunch of kids going to the concert. So let's just think about an SUV leaving the suburbs and heading for the concert. Would that vehicle on the way to the concert have passengers? Would that driver have passengers, teenage passengers? Yes. No one goes to a concert alone. You know, that's the kiss of death. Would a teenage driver be inexperienced by definition? So if you've got a teenager driving, by definition, you've added the risk factor of inexperience. Is there a decent chance that somebody won't be wearing their seatbelts? Yes, particularly in the back seat of that vehicle. Particularly in the back seat, people are prone not to wear their seatbelts. If they're on their way to a concert, is there a decent chance some alcohol and drugs have been consumed? Is there a better chance that the driver is under the influence? Is there a better chance that other people are under the influence in the car and are distracting the driver? Yes. Is the driver sleep deprived? If he's a teenager or a college student, the answer to that is yes. And you might say, well, Dale, how could you just state categorically that the teenage driver would be sleep deprived? And I could do that because all teenagers are sleep deprived, as we'll talk about. And that's not an exaggeration, or not much of one. And then concerts occur at night. And so you could literally have every single one of these 7 factors that increase the chances of having a catastrophe occur. You could have those present in one event, kids going to a concert. As is true in this case, this one's from California. Had this in my slideshow for 20 years. This 16-year-old boy, William, died in this accident. But it was, let's look at the factors. It was late on a Saturday night, so that's night driving. The driver had just gotten his license, so it was not only an experienced driver, but an inexperienced driver among inexperienced drivers, 16-year-olds, teenagers. The victim was the only fatality, and he was in the back seat and the only person not wearing a seatbelt. And this consisted of a driver plus multiple passengers. I think there were 6 in the vehicle. It's my view of that bullet point's obscured, but I believe that's true. So you have virtually all of these factors in play, except for alcohol and drugs. The state police said there were no alcohol and drugs involved. But you had all of these different risk factors coming together at a single time. So let's talk about these risk factors in a little bit more detail, because this is not just background information. My hope is that this is information parents can use in making decisions about whether to allow your teenager to drive someplace on a given night or weekend, that you'd be thinking about these things. So let's begin with passengers. I think the data from this study, which came out in 2012, has been really helpful in helping all of us understand the relationship between having teenage passengers in a car with teenage drivers and the crash risk. So this is a AAA foundation supported study that basically is doing this. It's looking at making comparisons of the risk that the driver, a teenage driver, 16 to 17-year-old, will die based on the number of passengers that he or she has in a car with him on a given trip. If the teenage driver is alone, that's that first column, then these experimenters say, let's say their risk of dying in that crash or dying in a crash that night is that they just set that at 1 for comparison. Then if you add 1 teenage passenger, in other words, your driver has 1 passenger, the risk that driver will die that night in crash goes up to 40%, 1.4. If there are, so let me see here. If there are 2 passengers, then that risk is doubled. So the risk that your teenager will drive, the #1 cause of death among teenagers, motor vehicle crashes, goes up, is doubled on a given night if she has 2 passengers, or he does. And if he or she has 3 or more passengers, the risk goes up more than 4-fold. Now that's dramatic. That's really impressive. That a teenager goes out driving one night. It's already the single most likely cause of death of teenagers. And it's increased more than 4-fold by the presence of a car full of kids, 3 or 4 passengers. So that's a kids going to the concert scenario. That's a kids leaving the football game scenario with a 16 or a 17-year-old driver. This is for male drivers alone. So, I'm sorry, these are just for male drivers. So again, the risk of that male driver dying that night, if we set that arbitrarily to 1 for comparison purposes, goes up 70%, goes up by a factor of 0.7, not by a factor of 0.7, you see though. Almost doubles, and then more than triples if you get, again, a car full of teenagers. This is a point in a live talk in which I ask people to raise their hand if they have daughters. I can still do that. Raise your hand if you have daughters. This is the data for teenage girls. So a 16 to 17-year-old teenage girl on average, we set her risk of dying at 1 if she's by herself. And we see it goes up a little bit, actually goes up less steeply than for boys. It doubles if they have 2 passengers. And then look what happens. If they have a 3 or 4 passengers, their risk of dying in that vehicle goes up 6.4 from 1. So that to me is astounding data. I still remember the first time I read this study and just being astonished by it. And for whatever reason, girls are, first of all, teenagers differ fundamentally from adults on this. Adults don't have their crash risk increase by passengers. Teenagers do. And girl drivers, teenage young women who drive, are more sensitive to the distraction of having teenage passengers in the car with them than are boys. Both are, it's a factor for both, but it's even more dramatic for young women who are driving. All right, so one thing to consider is that once your teenager is 15 or even 14, he or she may have friends, certainly if they're 15, who've already been licensed, because those will be kids in their own grades. And you might have your kids who don't yet have the license, they're not turned 16, are going to want to drive with are going to want to ride with their friends. And so that's another major source of crashes and mortality. Injuries and mortality, bad things that happen to teenagers is riding around with young drivers. So how can we keep them safe? So here's a recommendation for you. If you have a brand new driver, they should not have any young passengers, teenage passengers, friends, in other words, for the first 3 or 6 months that they drive. And I don't think the data can tell us how long that should be. That probably that should be something that parents judge based on what you know about your teenager. But I think the data do tell us that it would be better and safer for your teenager to get some more driving experience before they're allowed to transport other teenagers and to be distracted by those other teenagers. Then after this period of weeks or months, whatever you decide, then you say, okay, now you've had enough experience as a driver that you can have 1 passenger with you, as long as her parents agree, right? And then you reevaluate that periodically. And as long as you have control over who they have in the car with them, like before they go to college, then I suggest you maintain strict rules about limits on passengers. And remember that we are allowed to have, as parents, stricter rules in Alabama. So your clever teenager may say, you say I can't have any passengers, but the law in Alabama says I can have 1. You're allowed to say, I don't care what the law of Alabama says. I'm going to make it stricter. You can't have a passenger until you've gained more experience. So don't let them rope you into thinking that the law compels you to allow your child to have a passenger. It doesn't. Right? So anyway, that one just always tickles me. For a passenger, in other words, if your teenager's not driving yet, rules to consider. You may not ride with any driver who's been licensed less than X amount of time, whatever that is, weeks or months. You must get my permission every time you want to ride with somebody. You can't just jump into a car with somebody after the football game. And you have to make sure, if you're in a car with somebody, that you're wearing your seatbelt, that it's not packed up with kids, and that there's no alcohol and drugs involved. Those are rules to have for your seatbelts. So the main thing to know about seatbelts in teenagers is that teenagers are less likely to wear their seatbelts than other drivers, than adult drivers. Teenagers are less likely to wear their seatbelts when they're passengers than adults. Say about seatbelts. All we need to say about seatbelts is that we know that of teenage passengers who get killed, in car crashes, about 60% of them were not wearing their seatbelts. And again, I mentioned this earlier, but pay attention to how many of these terrible accidents, the casualties, the people hurt or killed, are people from the back seat not wearing their seatbelts. Happens a lot. So as you see news articles about these terrible crashes, pay attention to that. How often the people who die are in the back seat, not wearing seatbelts. Alcohol and other drugs. Now, obviously, doing drugs and drinking and driving is a risk factor for all of us. It's a boneheaded thing to do if you're 40. It's a boneheaded thing to do if you're 17. But what's the difference? There is a difference. So not to beat this to death, but I just want to share this chart, which gives the same information in a different way. Blood alcohol levels, 2 levels on the left column there, first column, 0.07 and then 0.08 or higher. So if the driver is 21 or older, if the blood alcohol level is 0.07, they're twice as likely to crash as if they had no alcohol. You get to about 0.07 and higher, for adult drivers, the crash risk goes up 7-fold. So that's no small matter, obviously. But look at drivers under 21. A 0.07 blood alcohol level gets them to 11 times more likely to have a crash than they would otherwise. And if they are at a 0.08 blood alcohol level, they are 39 times more likely to have a deadly crash than if they were stone sober. I just don't know how it could be any clearer and more compelling than that data. So a tip for your teenager is, if you are driving and a passenger brings drugs or alcohol into your car and the police pull you over as the driver, you will be charged, because as the driver, you're transporting the drugs or alcohol. Let me say that again. This is courtesy of my friend and colleague at All in Mount Brook, Judge Casey Hairston. I don't know if you know Judge Hairston, but he's here in Mount Brook and he's an attorney, but he also hears cases as a judge in our municipal court. And Judge Hairston reminds us, if you are driving and you're a teenager, you're driving, and a passenger brings drugs or alcohol into the car, even if you know nothing about it, the police pull you over, you will be charged as the driver, because you are transporting drugs or alcohol in that car. So let's talk about sleep. And I made the statement earlier, I think many parents know this now. that all teenagers are sleep deprived. And how can I make such an outrageous statement? We've known for a long time, 40 years, I think, that teenagers need an average. The average teenager needs an average of a little more than 9 hours of sleep per night. And we have data to suggest that only 30% of teenagers, get less than that. I don't believe it. They get less than 8 hours. Particularly in a community like Mount Brook or Vestavia or Hoover or Homewood, I suspect that, I think just about any neighborhood, teenagers are far less likely, or they're not going to get an average of 9 hours, or more than 9 hours of sleep per night. Now, I occasionally have a parent coming to me and say, yeah, my daughter's great about going to sleep, making sure she gets all the sleep she needs. But when you have high school start when it does, you have a lot of kids roll out of bed at 6 o'clock. I can't do the math right now. Yeah, that would mean they'd have to be asleep by 9 o'clock to be able to get, 6 hours of sleep. They need to be in bed by 10 and asleep by 10 if they get up at 6 o'clock. You can do the math, but you get my point. Just look at your own teenager during a school week, on school night. When do you think they're getting to sleep? Which may, by the way, be different from when they're actually getting to sleep, because we have other data to tell us that parents overestimate the amount of sleep their teenagers are getting, because you don't know when they're going to sleep. So most teenagers are walking around, almost all teenagers are walking around in a state of sleep deprivation, which means they're less safe as drivers. Sleep deprivation doubles the risk of an accident or a crash. It doubles the risk, nearly doubles the risk that they'll run into a pedestrian. And for motor vehicle crashes, it increases the number of crashes. Being sleep deprived, it increases the chance of having multiple crashes. In other words, a teenager who's already had 2 accidents by the time they turn 17. And it increases the chances of an accident that involves running off the road. So it's not just about falling asleep at the wheel, meaning that the sleep deprivation doesn't increase the crashes just because people fall asleep at the wheel. If I'm sleep deprived and I'm driving home, I don't have to go to sleep to cause an accident. My sleep deprivation may cause me to have an accident even though I never go to sleep at the wheel. By impairing my reflexes, by impairing my visual perception, my judgment, my distractibility, many of my cognitive functions that I need to have firing on all cylinders, again, no pun intended, aren't going to be firing on all cylinders if I'm sleep deprived. So sleep deprivation increases crash risk independent of falling asleep at the wheel, which is bad enough. Let's talk about distracted driving. Since about 2012, remember this guy, Governor Robert Bentley? He signed a bill making it unlawful for any of us to do this with our phone, texting while driving. Hard to enforce, maybe rarely enforced, but it is unlawful for all of us. So let me pause and say this. I only have one concern about the demonization of texting while driving, which we all do. We all say that's crazy. And many of us who do text and drive still say it's crazy, which is a whole other thing. But the only problem with this don't text and drive movement, because it's obviously a good idea to try to stop people from texting and driving, but the problem I have with it is that it suggests that it's perfectly okay to talk on your phone when you're driving, and it's not. Now, it may be true, and it appears to be true, that if you're texting or operating your phone physically while driving, that is more risky than talking, but it is still very risky to talk on your phone while you drive. irrespective of Bluetooth. Bluetooth use does not make you a safer driver than doing this, right? Because it's not really about what you're doing with your hands. It's about what you're doing mentally. And if you are on a phone call, even Bluetooth, it is diverting some of the focus and attention that you need to require to be your safest driver, be the safest driver you can be. It's diverting that from being safe. Driving, even when we do it automatically, without thinking about it, is still complex. It requires a lot of information processing. What do these traffic patterns mean? What's this car over here doing? What does that light mean? What does that sign mean? What do these road conditions mean? And granted, after a while, some of that becomes automated. But if we get on a phone call, it is diverting our mental resources away from that information processing into trying to process a telephone call. So no matter who you are, you add to your danger. You add to the danger of driving significantly by choosing to use your phone while you're driving. There's no question about it. Now, there's a subset of people, says the research, that may be what they call super multitaskers. People who are able to multitask, like when they're driving, and still do it safely. But they amount to no more than 1.5% of the population. The problem is we all think we're in that category. We all think it's the other people who can't handle it. So I can do it, because I've been texting and driving and talking on my phone and driving for years. I haven't had an accident doing it yet. So therefore I must have a special skill. Probably not. What you probably have is luck. Just luck. All right. This is just to get to the point that hands-free technology does not reduce cell phone risk. We have multiple studies to indicate that's true. So when you're on a phone, whether you're texting or just talking, it slows your reaction time and it causes something called informational blindness. It reduces by about a factor of 1/2 the amount of visual information we process when we drive. So when a person is, they have these laboratories now with driving simulators. They have this at UAB here in Birmingham, where they can track how your eyes are moving when you're driving, where you're looking. So you can track your eye movements. And what they find is that if you're not using a cell phone, your eyes are scanning in this blue box. So, my dad, I think, probably told me I need to look straight ahead, which is fair, but when you're looking straight ahead, you're not really looking straight ahead. You're scanning a box, looking for a car coming this way, a kid on a skateboard coming this way. You're scanning that box. That's a safe thing, and it's automatic. For reasons that are not fully understood, when you're on a cell phone, your eye movements are in this box. So it narrows the information and reduces the information that you truly process. It's not that the school bus over here won't land on your retinas. It will. But you're less likely to fully process that bus being there. I took this photograph some years ago out on Church Street in Mountain Brook. By the way, I was able to stand in the middle of the road here because there was a Coors truck parked in the median, so I could stand behind it and take this picture. So if you're not on your phone, think of this as being what you're scanning. There's a sidewalk that runs across here, and you might be more likely to process the presence of people walking in the street on that crosswalk. On if you're on your phone, whether you're texting or you're just on your phone, then it sort of blurs out. Again, it's not really focus here is a metaphor. It's not so much like literal focus of the image on your retinas, but your mental focus on the factor. So there's information there you're just not as likely to process, and it turns out to be on the periphery of the vision. So I'm talking about teenagers, but I'm also talking about us. This is true of all drivers. This is a case also, something that Judge Harrison pointed out to me. This is the Raines case. It was out of Mobile, and I believe it set a precedent in Alabama. Jonathan Raines was a young man who served time in prison. I think he must be out by now. I'm sure he is. But he was sentenced in state courts for vehicular, or I guess reckless manslaughter. When he was 21, he was looking at his cell phone, and while he was driving, and he struck a Honda head on, and it killed Miranda Hamilton, who was 24 years old. He got convicted of manslaughter. It got upheld on appeal, and he was sent to prison. And you might look at this mugshot and think, well, it looks like a rough guy. My understanding, he was not a rough guy, kind of a gentle guy, worked for his dad, active in his church, never been in any trouble before, and he went to state prison. And so if you or your teenager uses a phone while driving, remember Jonathan was 21 years old, it may contribute to you killing someone, and you would have to live with that forever. That's something all of us choose to forget. Every time we check for baseball box scores on our phone, or we check the weather, or we dial a number, or even if we're just talking on the phone, we know that increases our risk, or we should know that we might kill somebody and have to live with that forever. But you may also have to live with it while sitting in a cell in a state prison in Alabama. If you know anything about state prisons in Alabama, that's not something you want for your teenager or for yourself, but this is a real possibility. This is not rhetoric. This has happened. The last one is night driving, and all I want to say about night driving as one of these major risk factors, remember that's what we're doing, we're going through risk factors. Teenagers tend to drive at night and on weekends because otherwise they're in school. So obviously it's generally less safe to drive at night because it's dark. And there's also more people on the roads that are driving too fast and drinking and so on. Little section of the talk I call bad ideas, with all due respect. 16th birthday car. I think it's a mistake to give a child, give a teenager their own vehicle on their 16th birthday. Truth be known, while I'm telling the truth, I think it's generally a bad idea to give a 16-year-old a car at all. I think it would be better for a 16-year-old to borrow a family vehicle until they're 17. There's evidence, not a lot of research, but there is some research that suggests that a teenager is more likely to have a wreck in a car that's their car, sorry about the air quotes, than if they borrow a parent's car. A compromise could be that at some point during year 16, after they turn 16, not on their birthday, but at some time during that first year of driving, that you would add another vehicle to your fleet. You get another car. But you say to your child, your teenager, if they say, can I drive to the summit tonight? Instead of saying, yeah, drive your car, you could say, tonight drive the Acura, or tonight drive the Honda. In other words, discourage your teenager from having a sense of personal ownership of that vehicle until they're 17. Then maybe at 17 you say, okay, you can have the Acura or you can have the Honda. You can call that your car. But I feel strongly that it's a mistake. And I'm basing it on research. It's not a moral judgment. So it's research based. That's a mistake to give a teenager a car on their birthday. And just bear with me on this for a minute, because I do think it's worth considering. There really is a kind of a psychology to gift giving. So my birthday's March 25th. If somebody were to come by my office and say, "Hey, happy birthday, Dale, here's a fountain pen." I like fountain pens. If they do that, there's an unspoken set of rules, and that is a gift is a transfer of ownership. So if you give me a fountain pen for my birthday, you're not going to call me 3 weeks later and ask me if I'm making responsible use of the pen. You're not going to hold me accountable for my use of your gift. And so when we say to kids, "Happy birthday, here is your car," they have every right to believe what we're saying, which is that it's their car for them to do with as they will. Now, you might do the responsible thing and step in and say, "Oh yeah, but there's going to be rules." But there's still this sort of, it's yours, right? And I think that contributes to the risk of a crash. We probably should worry less about whether the car will look good on the parking lot of a high school and more concerned about safety. So we shouldn't be thinking about hot cars or the latest car or the coolest car, but what can get them safely to their shift at Piggly Wiggly after school. Same idea. For years I've been saying that if you're thinking about giving your 16-year-old a vehicle, which you ought to think twice about anyway, and that vehicle has a winch on the front of it and a roll bar, it's probably not a good idea. Can't leave this out. Meanest mom on the planet. Old's 1999 intrigue. Totally uncool parents who obviously don't love their teenage son is selling his car, only driven for 3 weeks before Snoopy mom, who needs to get a life, found booze under the front seat. $3,700 the best offer. Call meanest mom on the planet. So that's accountability. That's really holding kids accountable and being courageous. All right, having scared you half to death and depressed you, now what do? Educate. We need to provide kids with more driving safety education and experience. We need, related to that, better training. They're not the same thing. And we need to be smart about what we allow them to drive, what kind of vehicle. And we need to have rules that are written down in a contract. So this slide, which is available to you, is just kind of a summary. And what I've done is I've taken those 7 risk factors: inexperience, having passengers in the car, seat belts, alcohol and drugs, sleep, distracted driving, so forth, and talked about in general the kinds of things that parents can do to reduce the risks that come from those factors. So just take an example, passengers, which we talked about so much. One thing to do is to make sure your teenagers know that. You've told them multiple times that the more people they have in the car with them, the more likely they are to die. Not to mention, the more likely they are to be responsible for an accident that kills or injures their friends. You can enforce the graduated driving license law in Alabama at minimum, and really go beyond that, which is to say you can't have a passenger until you've gotten more experience under your belt as a driver by yourself. And then you address this in a contract. So those are examples of things that a parent-teen driving contract that we can do. So you can look at all these things. Parent-teen contract. I have one. First of all, these slides I keep at parentingteendrivers.com, and also there, parentingteendrivers.com is a contract which I've had out there for many years. I don't make any money from it, which is the reason I don't mind hawking it on this video. It's been around a long time in wide use. So you can find my You can find, this is what the website looks like when you go to it. I think it's what it looks like now, different sections to it. And then you go to the contract and you can download it into your word processor or your computer or Word or whatever it is. And you can kind of customize it. But the contract consists of rules that you are insisting on as a parent and consequences for breaking those rules. Now, here's my thing. In this contract, there's one and only one consequence for a teenager breaking one of the driving rules. Now, assuming that there might be other consequences, like the law might fine them and the authorities might take their driver's license away, but generally speaking, you're only going to impose one consequence for them breaking the rules. Most driving contracts say, in fact, mine said this more than 10 years ago, is if they break a rule, just don't let them drive for a while. And I think there's a problem with that. The problem with not letting them drive at all, that may be the right thing to do, particularly for a really grievous breach of the contract. They really break a rule and break it big time. Maybe you take them off of the road for a while. But the problem with that is when they're not driving, they're not getting more experience. So if you really need to take them off the road, my suggestion is keep that relatively short. Then instead of just keeping them off the road, get back in the car with them. Revert to learner's permit mode again. Get back in the car for X number of weeks, whatever it is, days or weeks. And I'll mention that again in a minute. Another thing about the contract is I recommend against trying to use a contract to do something like this. I will let you drive when you show me you can be more responsible, or when you do the dishes, or when you do this or that. I think it's a mistake to use the contract as kind of a general way of trying to get some behavior out of your kid that you've been wanting to get out of him for years. Driving's too important. Driving safety is too important to holding it hostage to something that's not as important. Grades are not as important. I know that's a judgment call, but I'm happy to make it. Grades and academic performance are not as important as trying to avoid deadly motor vehicle crashes. So same thing with tying driving to grades. I think that's widely done. You know, my contract's used all over the country, and I still get emails from people that read, I loved your contract. The only thing we changed is we put in that you had to have an X, like GPA, like 3.0 or B's or whatever. I don't think that's a terrible thing to do, but I think it's a bad idea. Because again, it ties something essential like driving safety to grades, which are not, they're important. But I think what the message ought to be, this is about you being a safe driver and not about anything else. That's my opinion. I've held for a long time. So earlier I said that instead of taking them off the road, if they break the contract, break a rule, you pull their independent driving privileges for a period of time, days, weeks if it's super serious. All right. So the advantage of that, of going into learner's permit mode again, instead of taking them off the road, is they become better drivers during that time because they're driving. It gives you a chance to do more supervision, to give more recommendations, to do more teaching. All right. Okay, while we're on this topic of a contract, this is one of my favorite questions. Dr. Wisely, I liked your contract, but we didn't do a written contract. We just talked about it. We just had a conversation. We had an oral understanding. And my response to that would be, why do we ever have contracts? What's the point of a contract? If I'm going to buy your house, even if we know each other and love each other and trust each other, why are we going to have a contract? I guess that's a legal requirement, but why would we do? Why is that a good idea? Well, one idea is that a contract provides clarity and it also reduces subsequent disputes. So I might say to my teenager, hey, now once you start driving, I don't want you on the south side. Also don't want you on the interstate. How is it hard to imagine that your teenager might, or my teenager might say later, you never said that to me. And I say, oh, yes, I did. And they say, oh, no, you didn't. And off you go, right? Wouldn't it be nice to be able to say, it's right here. It's right here in the right here in the contract. So, a contract does not have to be, the conversation around these rules and contracts does not have to be disrespectful. And I don't think it should be. I think it ought to be respectful, level-headed, but firm. So I've given you a script, which, you don't have to use this, but give you an idea of the tone that you might consider. You're going to be driving a vehicle that's got my name on the title. Even if you say it's your car, it's my car, because my name on the title. I share with you the responsibility for what you do as a driver. If you have an accident, the whole family is going to be affected. If you get hurt or killed, that's going to be grief for us and a bunch of people. If you hurt somebody else, that's a problem for our family, not just for you. I have a duty as your parent to protect your safety and that of the passengers or people that could get hurt because of your driving. And so this is serious business. And I'm not just going to throw you the keys to a car and say, be careful out there. We're going to have rules. And the best way to be clear about those rules is to write them down and then to sign that contract. So you got the script there. This is my favorite question of all time. Dr. Weisel, love the idea of your contract, but my son refused to sign it. And I think, wow, this is not complicated. So I'm going to model for you how to handle this one. So this is stupid. I'm not going to sign it. None of the other kids have to do this, et cetera, et cetera. And you say, oh, I'm so sorry. There's been a misunderstanding. You are under no obligation at all to sign this contract. You don't have to sign it. Sorry I brought it up. Just so you know, I'm not going to allow you to drive until you do. And then you leave. Rather than argue with them, just get in the car, go to Target, pick up a few things, come back, and the contract will be signed. This is all about being firm and saying you may not drive until we sign a contract. Just as you might say to an employee, you're not working for me until you sign a contract. Or you're not driving a fleet vehicle that's got my company's name on it until we have rules in place and you've signed a contract, that you understand those rules. So another recommendation I have about the contract is that you revisit it. So there's a danger. The danger is you sign it, they sort of grudgingly sign it, and forget about it. Start with a strict contract, because that's when they first start driving, it's when they're at their most danger. So then maybe a month after you sign this contract and they start driving, you sit down again at the breakfast nook and you say, let's go through this, talk about how you're doing. And maybe if they're doing well, there might be something you negotiate. If they're not doing well, maybe you make the rules stricter. If they've been pushing the envelope, giving you a hard time. But the point is to revisit it, reread it, go over it again, to keep those rules fresh in your mind and certainly in the mind of your teenager. To help with this business of a teenager who signs it without reading it or signs it and forgets it, is you don't let that work as an excuse. There's this thing where they say ignorance of the law is no excuse. Well, ignorance of the parent-teen driving contract is no excuse. And one way to help with this is to make them read it to you aloud. It will help them retain it, and it just kind of helps convey the seriousness with which you take all of this. The last thing you want is a teenager whose dad is sort of suggesting This is something your mom wants to do. I think it's too much, but you don't want that. I don't think. You want everybody, and particularly your teenager, to believe this is serious business, and you're not taking it light. That's the contract. Another possibility is to provide more training. The whole basis of the idea of having a parent-teen driving contract that you enforce, where you say you may not drive by yourself until you agree to these rules and sign this contract. That means that personally, I think that the ability to drive independently when you're 16 ought to be conditional. But I don't have that attitude about the learner's permit. In my opinion, the learner's permit, you ought to encourage your teenager to get as early as they can and don't attach any conditions to it. Don't say, I won't let you get your learner's permit till you get your grades up, for example. Try to get it as early as you can and unconditional. Then during that, make sure that learner's permit year, this is my advice, is 1 full year, 12 months. Because you don't want to, that is critical time for your teenager to learn to be a safe driver, and you don't want to shortchange it. The law in Alabama allows you to shortchange it. You can wait until your child is 15 years, 6 months. They get their learner's permit at 15 years, 6 months. They have their learner's permit for 6 months. Then they could go once they turn 16 and get their full license. But that would be shortchanging that training period. So unconditional. And then during that 1 year, let's say that for whatever reason, they don't get their learner's permit until 2 months after their birthday, their 15th birthday. Then I think you should have I recommend you have a requirement that they have to have their learner's permit for 12 months minimum before you let them go and sit for the driving test. During that 12 months, I hope that you could provide as much supervised experience to your child as a driver, lots of it, under a variety of conditions. So the driving test, Alabama law says that you have to sign a paper saying that during the learner's permit year, you as a parent have to certify that you spent 50 hours. I think Alabama law has been updated. I think now it's 50 hours. I think this is an error, but it is the best data we have is that 50 hours is a minimum. And so you need to be able to, for sure, know that you provided that. And I think it's important to keep a log. Now, why keep a log? It may sound like it's being OCD, and I'm not an obsessive person. The only way you will know that it's 50 hours, or at least 50 hours, is to keep a log. Because with all due respect to teenagers, if you spend 2 hours on a Saturday afternoon teaching your teenager to drive, it will seem like 6. And you'd be forgiven for thinking that you spent 6 hours and when only you spent 2. So keep a log, and there are actually apps to help you do that. Smartphone apps specifically to help you track that. Now, under a variety of conditions, this is to me an easy thing for parents to neglect. It's completely understandable. So what do? It's 72 degrees, sunny, Saturday afternoon, and we say, let's go practice driving. And the next time it's nice outside, we practice driving again. So let's flip this, and let's say it's a Tuesday night, 38 degrees outside, windy and drizzling. Who says, hey, let's get out of our warm house, turn off Netflix, and go practice driving? Probably nobody. And as a result of that, the first time your child will drive when it's raining and dark and cold and wet outside, they'll be by themselves. So we should be thinking about putting in night hours, not just day hours, rainy weather, not just nice weather, looking for different kinds of weather, light, road conditions, to give our kids supervised experience learning to drive in those. And then during this year, I recommend, pardon me, pardon me, having written rules about who your 15-year-old can ride with, kind of referencing back to the dangers involved in that. More training issues. So private instruction, if you have the resources to get this. A lot of communities, including Mount Brook, have this available through a school board or a community education program where you can get somebody who will spend somebody who's trained in driving instruction to spend some time with your teenager. And I think that's provides something that parents can't provide. Most of us, so we have this critically important skill, driving, literally life and death. And who do we learn it from? Most of us learn it from a parent who is neither a professional educator or a professional driver. So how wonderful it is if we have the resources to be able to add to that some instruction by a private trained person, like a driving instructor. And so I really believe that adds to safety. Also a good idea are so-called crisis driving programs. And that's usually a few hours on a weekend offered by some organization where they get kids out on a course with orange cones and different obstacles and teach them how to do crisis maneuvers, how to handle a skid, how to handle a swerve. And that's something that's hard for us to provide just driving around in the suburbs or wherever. University of Montevallo has had a program going for, I know, 40 years, if not, and probably longer than that. And your resource guide has some information on how to enroll your child in those weekend crisis driving programs. I'm a big fan of those. I think that adds a skill to your child's repertoire of skills that can help keep them unhurt and keep their passengers unhurt and pedestrians unhurt. I mentioned there are apps. This is one I checked on recently. There are others. Road Ready is an app that helps you track how much time you are spending teaching your kid to drive under different conditions. I did not check to see if it's still available, but check around. Some common errors are made by teenagers who are driving. I'm not going to go through these. So you can look at these on the slides or look at your handout. The point of these is that these will give you, this is what research tells us, are mistakes made by new drivers. And so this will give you just some focus, some things to kind of check off your list during the year you're teaching a teenager how to drive, is being aware of these common errors. I'm going to move forward on this. You can obviously stop the video or refer to your handout. All right, just a few things about the vehicle. There's lots of information out there about crash safety and easy to find now on the internet. And so one consideration for what car you're going to let your teenager drive would be crash safety. But another factor, which I've alluded to before, is I'm a big believer in delaying having your teenager have a car they consider their own. So that's the whole discouragement of happy birthday, here's your new Volvo, or whatever. That waiting, letting them borrow one of your cars for a while after they turn 16, I think is a sensible thing to do, kind of backed up by the data. I talked about having them drive an additional family car rather than a car they call their own. I think in a perfect world, we would not have 16-year-olds allowed to say, here's my car, this is my car. I think it adds to the danger, to be blunt. I don't mean to make a value judgment. That's based on research. When I was raising my daughters, by the way, my wife and I are raising our daughters. They're all well into adulthood now, and so there are things I do differently, particularly as we learn more. I would love to tell you I took every little bit of my advice. I didn't. But some of our departures from my standard advice is based on what we knew about that individual child. But for the most part, they all signed contracts. We all stuck with the rules. Uh, None of them got cars on their birthdays, etc. There are a ton of technological tools to help parents with keep their kids safe when they're driving and riding. Most of smartphones, iPhones have Find My Friends. There are all kinds of apps that use GPS to know where that phone is. And those are your friend when you're trying to keep up with a brand new driver or a passenger with a new driver. So there are also different dedicated GPS monitoring systems that you can install in the vehicle. They're not terribly expensive. Verizon has one. There are others that are out there where you install this little box in the diagnostic jack that most fairly late model cars have. I guess all of them do. A diagnostic jack, plug that little black box in, and you can track the location of the vehicle in real time. It'll tell you the speed, it'll tell you how hard the turns are, if they're banking too much when they're turning. There are apps to block texting and phone calls when a person's driving. Now you can control some of that. You can't control all of it, but you can certainly say to your teenager, this is perfectly reasonable, that you can't drive unless I can look on my phone and tell where you are. And they might talk about privacy issues and all that. I get that, but you just have to decide what's at stake. Um, I think that'd be fine, in my humble opinion. This is an example. I don't endorse any of this stuff. I haven't tried any of this stuff. But if they would comp me these products, I probably would. But this is one I just ran across the internet. This is a device that you buy for 67 bucks. Plug it in to your car or the car your kid's going to drive, and then you pay a monthly fee, and that allows you to track where they are. Pretty good. So summarizing, better training, be smart about the vehicles that they drive, and have a contract. I'm done. I want to thank a couple people. Judge Casey Harrison for the information about some of these legal cases. Ben Jackson, who's an individual who's provided me with some ideas and information over the years. Mary Halsey Maddox, a Mountain Brook parent who's a pediatrician at Children's Hospital, expert on sleep. And certainly the Mountain Brook Board of Education. I don't work directly for the board anymore, but they were incredibly supportive of the years that I spent building this program at Mountain Brook and elsewhere. My website's at parentingteendrivers.com. I make no money from it. I get nothing from it. It's just a way to provide information. So please feel free to check that out. And there's a lot of great information on the web that just wasn't there several years ago. Hope this has been helpful to you. Thanks for tuning in. Bye.